The words hung in the air, sharp and brittle, like shards of glass. "You're just useless, Mom. Completely useless." He didn't even look at me, his eyes glued to the glowing screen of his phone, the words tossed out with the same casual indifference he might use to discard a crumpled napkin. Useless. The world tilted, just for a second, the familiar hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen suddenly sounding like a desperate lament. It was Tuesday, just past 11 in the morning, and the sun, usually so generous with its light, seemed to dim outside the bay window. I was sorting through a pile of mail, bills mostly, the mundane arithmetic of running a household. My routine, a carefully constructed dam against the tide of recent years, had just been breached by a single, venomous phrase. My son, David, was 26. He lived at home, of course. The market was brutal, he'd explained with an air of weary sophistication, and besides, he was working on his startup. This startup, a nebulous entity he'd been developing for 3 years, involved a lot of late nights, loud music, and a perpetually growing list of online subscriptions. My role, in his grand design, had morphed from mother to live-in caterer, chauffeur, and, apparently, unpaid, utterly devalued domestic staff. He'd always been demanding, I knew that. A child who knew the sound of his own wants before they even formed on his lips. But this felt different. This wasn't frustration, it was a pronouncement. A judgment. And it landed with the quiet, devastating force of a verdict. I remembered, with a familiar ache, the time he was 7. He'd wanted a specific toy, a ridiculously oversized action figure that cost more than my weekly grocery budget. I'd explained, gently, that it was too expensive, that we had to be sensible with money. He'd thrown a tantrum, a spectacular display of theatrical sobs and accusations of me being mean. Later that evening, after he'd fallen asleep clutching a much smaller, more affordable robot, I'd found a crudely drawn picture on his bedside table. It depicted a stick figure with a giant money bag for a head, labeled Mom, with a big red X through it. Even then, the sting of his immaturity was laced with an unnerving understanding of leverage. He knew how to wound. Then there was the graduation. My husband, his father, had passed away 2 years prior, leaving a significant void and a more significant estate. David, still reeling from his grief, had nevertheless managed to insert himself into every conversation about the will, about the investments, about the future. He'd insisted on managing my affairs, his tone a peculiar blend of solicitous concern and thinly veiled impatience. I'd found myself deferring to him on decisions I'd made with my husband for decades. One evening, after a particularly tense discussion about refinancing the mortgage, a discussion where he'd dismissed my reservations with a wave of his hand and a patronizing smile, I'd found him on my laptop, poring over bank statements. When I gently inquired, he'd snapped, "I'm just making sure things are being handled properly, Mom. You wouldn't want any unpleasant surprises, would you?" The implication was clear, I was incapable of handling things myself. I was a liability. These were just glimpses, vignettes of a slow erosion. Each instance a small pebble added to a growing pile of resentment, a subtle shift in the power dynamic that I, in my quiet way, had always tried to smooth over. I'd excused his behavior as stress, as grief, as youthful ambition. I'd swallowed my hurt, my frustration, telling myself that he was my son, and that was enough. It was supposed to be enough. The silence after his declaration stretched, thick and suffocating. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My throat felt tight, my lungs struggling for air. I watched him, his fingers flying across the keyboard, oblivious to the seismic shift he'd just engineered. The sunlight, now truly diminished, cast long, accusatory shadows across the room. I stood there, holding a stack of bills, feeling the weight of them, the mundane reality they represented, and a cold, hard clarity settled over me. Useless. The word echoed, no longer a cruel insult, but a factual assessment of my current position. And in that moment, a decision, stark and absolute, formed in the stillness. I put the mail down on the hall table. My movements were slow, deliberate. I didn't storm off, I didn't cry, I didn't raise my voice. I simply walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and sat at the table. I didn't look at him. I didn't need to. His attention was still solely on his screen, on his world. I spent the next hour there, nursing the water, feeling the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the antique clock on the wall. I listened to the tap-tap-tap of his keyboard, the occasional grunt of exertion or frustration. I was present, but I was not available. Later that afternoon, I went to my study. It was a room I'd largely abandoned, its shelves lined with books I no longer read, its desk cluttered with forgotten projects. My husband had insisted on keeping it a sanctuary for my intellectual pursuits. I opened the large mahogany desk, its drawers usually locked, the keys kept safely in a small, ornate box. I unlocked them, one by one. Inside the top drawer, beneath a faded silk scarf, was a slim manila folder. It contained documents. Important documents. Documents I'd helped my husband meticulously organize years ago, before his illness had taken hold. I took the folder to the dining room table, away from David's living room battlefield. I spread the contents out. There were deeds, trust agreements, investment portfolios, insurance policies. And at the very bottom a sealed envelope addressed to me. My husband's familiar, elegant script. I opened it. It was a letter, penned in his hand, a testament to his foresight and his understanding of our son. He had foreseen this. He had braced me for it, in his own way, by leaving me with the tools to navigate it. For the next 48 hours, I moved through the house like a ghost. I made meals, but only the bare essentials. I cleaned only what was absolutely necessary to maintain a semblance of order. I spoke only when spoken to, my answers brief and factual. David barely noticed. He was too engrossed in his startup, in his digital kingdom. He'd come in for food, offering a perfunctory thanks, his eyes already drifting back to his laptop. The word useless had been a dismissal, an erasure, and it had worked. He'd made me invisible. Then, on Thursday morning, the silence began to crack. David emerged from his room, looking disheveled and irate. He found me in the living room, not sorting mail, not dusting, but sitting in my husband's old armchair, a legal document spread across my lap. The sunlight, brighter now, caught the crisp edges of the paper. "Mom, have you seen my charger?" "The good one?" he asked, his voice already laced with annoyance. I didn't look up immediately. I finished reading a paragraph, my finger tracing the fine print. "No, David. I haven't." He huffed. "Seriously? It's got to be somewhere." He started rummaging through the clutter on the coffee table, kicking a stray shoe with unnecessary force. "David," I said, my voice calm, level. He froze, surprised by the direct address. I finally looked at him. His face was a mask of adolescent impatience, but beneath it, a flicker of something else. Uncertainty. "You know," I continued, my gaze steady, "when you told me I was useless on Tuesday." His eyes narrowed. "Oh, here we go. Are we going to have a pity party now?" "No," I said, shaking my head slowly. "It just made me think about what useful actually means." I held up the document. It was a detailed financial report, complete with charts and projections. "Your father, bless his soul, always believed in being prepared. He made provisions for everything." David scoffed. "What are you even talking about?" "This," I said, gesturing to the document, "is a summary of the trust fund he set up. For me. And for the upkeep of this house. And for certain future contingencies." He took a step closer, his annoyance shifting to a wary curiosity. "Contingencies? What contingencies?" "Well," I said, my voice still quiet, but with an underlying steel that surprised even myself, "he anticipated, shall we say, potential financial irresponsibility." David's jaw tightened. He knew. He knew his father's meticulous nature, his tendency to plan for every eventuality. "That's ridiculous. Dad wouldn't have." "Wouldn't have what, David?" I interrupted softly. "Wouldn't have seen that his son, even with the best intentions, might struggle with managing significant assets?" Wouldn't have wanted to ensure his wife was taken care of, regardless of anyone else's startup ambitions? I stood up then, the document still in my hand. I walked over to the small side table, the one where David often left his keys and wallet. I placed the financial report on it, then reached into my pocket and pulled out a single, embossed card. It was a platinum credit card. "Your father was very clear," I said, my voice now devoid of any emotion, like the perfectly balanced ledger before me. "The accounts are structured so that any significant withdrawals, any major financial decisions that aren't directly related to the maintenance of this property or my personal needs, require my express authorization." And, I paused, letting the words sink in, he also included a clause regarding personal conduct. David's face was pale now. The smug arrogance that had characterized his dismissal of me was slowly draining away, replaced by a dawning horror. He knew my husband had been a brilliant lawyer, a master strategist. He'd always underestimated him, just as he'd underestimated me. "What are you saying?" he whispered, his voice strained. "I'm saying," I replied, my gaze sweeping over him, a calm, assessing look, "that for the last 2 years, you've been living in a house that is, essentially, mine. And you've been drawing from an account that, while it bears your father's name, is ultimately controlled by the terms of the trust. And those terms are now being strictly enforced." I didn't elaborate. I didn't need to. I could see the gears turning in his head, the frantic calculations. The realization that his entitlement, his assumptions, were built on sand. He had been so busy proving my uselessness, he'd never bothered to understand his own dependence. The next few days were a masterclass in controlled panic. David's frantic text started almost immediately. "Mom, we need to talk. Are you serious about this? This is insane, you can't do this." I ignored them. He tried calling. I let it go to voicemail. He even resorted to banging on my study door, his voice a desperate plea. "Mom. Please. Just open the door." He sent his aunt, my sister-in-law, to intercede. She arrived with a storm of indignant pronouncements, her voice shrill. "How could you do this to your own son? Your husband would never have wanted this." I met her at the door, my expression calm. I showed her the relevant sections of the trust document, the clauses my husband had so carefully drafted. Her indignation faltered, replaced by a bewildered silence. Then came the truly desperate measures. He contacted friends, former colleagues of my late husband, trying to rally support. He tried to get my lawyer involved, forgetting that my lawyer was bound by his client's instructions, my instructions. The flying monkeys, as some might call them, fluttered around me, chirping their concerns, their accusations, their desperate attempts to break down the wall I had erected. But the wall was solid, built not of brick and mortar, but of carefully documented facts and my late husband's unwavering foresight. David's pleas escalated. He started leaving notes under my door. "I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't mean it. Please, I need you." He even left a tear-streaked drawing, a crude imitation of the one he'd made as a child, this time showing stick figures holding hands. It was pathetic. It was calculated. And it was, in its own way, a testament to his eventual understanding of the game. The moment he truly understood he'd lost, the moment the arrogance evaporated completely, was when he tried to access his own bank account, the one he'd always used as a supplement to my generosity. He'd sent me a screenshot of a declined transaction, a red error message blinking accusingly. Beneath it, a single, shaky text, "My cards are blocked." "Mom, what did you do?" I had contacted the banks myself, discreetly. I'd informed them of the trust stipulations, the controlled access. It was all perfectly legal, perfectly within the parameters my husband had established. The fear in his eyes, when he finally confronted me in person, his voice cracking, his usual swagger gone, was a sight I had carried with me, a silent prophecy, for years. He didn't beg me to stop my actions, he begged me to restore his access, his privileges, his illusion of independence. He begged me to undo the consequences of his own words. I didn't yell. I didn't gloat. I simply sat there, the legal document still on the table, and watched him. He was finally seeing himself, not as the prodigy he'd imagined, but as the dependent he was. He didn't beg me to forgive him for calling me useless. He begged me to stop the practical, material consequences of that declaration. And in the quiet, cold logic of it all, there was a profound sense of closure. His pronouncement had been his undoing, and my silence, his quiet execution. The house, once his playground, was now simply mine, its resources carefully managed, its future secure. The hum of the refrigerator, once a sound of quiet endurance, now felt like the steady beat of a well-ordered life.